Welcome to the Green Wasp Removal YouTube channel. Today's episode is an update video for the Vespula Germanica nest that was growing in the barn that we've been documenting since late May of 2022. You can check out our other videos on this channel for previous updates on this nest. The last update was filmed around August 1st of 2022. We're going to start this update on August 7th, 22, and the footage in this update will cover right up till about September 5th or so. As you can see here, on August 7th, they were still foraging for wood pulp. That's what this little wasp is doing here. She's collecting wood pulp to take back to the nest, which is the material they use to build their nest with. Here on August 8th, we filmed for a number of minutes just to get an idea of what the wasps were up to. We saw a number of wasps coming and going from their usual front door, which is this nail hole in the side of the barn wall. What you can see here is they were bringing in something. It looks like wood pulp, possibly a little bit of insect protein, but in general, most of the wasps we observed, at least on this day, were not bringing in a lot of heavy protein. They were bringing in either a tiny bit of wood pulp or they came back empty-handed, which means maybe they were just out nectaring. Perhaps they have some nectar in their crop they will share with the nest. But none of them seem to have insect protein. And that was interesting because that might mean that their larva stage is slowing down. We also saw this guy. This is a green parasitic wasp, as far as we know, a chrysid wasp. And that may not bode well for larvae in the nest because chrysid wasps will use other wasps' nest as hosts, and they will allow their larvae that they inject into the other nest to feed on the host larva. So it's possible there was maybe some parasite action happening here. We're not entirely sure. So on August 9th, we checked the nest for growth, and it did have some growth, but it wasn't terribly significant compared to how it was on August 1st. If you compare this reference image from August 1st, you can see that the August 9th version of the nest is a little bit more filled out, especially on the upper left, but not much at all. And there definitely weren't many wasps zipping around the nest like we've seen in the past updates. They usually come bombing out and running around the nest doing their security checks when the light comes on and we film inside. But this time there's only one wasp. You just saw him there coming from the outside. Looked like a forager returning to the nest. But really we saw no other wasp activity. So whatever's going on, it was either going on inside the nest or all the foragers were out and about in the environment. Regardless, the colors of this nest are always appealing. I love the greens and the browns and the tans and the grays. It's a great mix of colors showing different sources of wood, some of which is from the actual wood of the barn frame. If you look back to the upper left of the frame in this shot, you can definitely see where they've been stripping some of the wood away during their foraging for wood pulp right there. So wherever you see that color on the nest, it may well be from that 2x4. The light grays are probably from some of the garden stakes and so forth that you saw at the beginning of this video when the little wasp was foraging. A week later, on August 14th, we went in again to take a look at it, and it had a little bit more buildup on the upper left of the nest again, and it's been a little bit more rounded out throughout. But again, not very significant growth change here. Maybe a little less than we would have expected, which leads us to believe maybe there's a lower population in this nest than you would otherwise see this time of year for whatever reason. It's possible they're building it out back toward the exterior wall behind the nest where we can't see right now, because if you look back in the back cavity, you can see some of the envelope they've constructed there. Maybe back there there's more growth. We just don't know. Can't see back there right now. But regardless, the whole thing seems a little small for this time of year. On this date, we did see a forager come out and do her security check. About a week later, on August 21st of 22, we went in again to take another look, and it really didn't seem like there was any significant growth at all. Very little activity in the nest. We're just not seeing as much activity in this nest as we would have expected for August. But, you know, they're still active. There are still some wasps coming and going. It just doesn't seem like it's thriving the way we thought it might. Here's another security check happening, but definitely a little quieter in there than we would have expected. If you check out some of our other videos, there's a Germanica nest we just removed here in August as well, and it was significantly larger than this one. On this nest, you see just one or two security checks from a couple of foragers when we brought in the bright lights and the camera. On a regular nest in August, you would think there'd be a higher population, there'd be a lot more activity, there'd be a lot more security checks happening with more foragers reacting to the light. So it just seems a little bit off. But, you know, every year, everything's different. Every nest is different. So we're still kind of mid-season on some of these nests. Even though we're getting in toward fall here, we should see activity on most Germanica nests. It's pretty active all the way through October, November. Usually the first hard frost is considered the end of the season because it tends to knock out a lot of the nests. We went in a week later here on August 27th. The same story. No significant growth. Everything seemed very quiet. There are signs of life on the nest. Obviously, there's some foragers coming and going we see from the outside. There's also, as you'll see here in a sec, the foragers doing their security checks when the lights come on inside. So it's active. There's live wasps doing what they do. It just seems a little bit less active than you might have expected. You know, back in May, we assumed by now most of that cavity would be filled up with nest, but that definitely did not happen here. There's any number of reasons why that may be. Some theories are there's a lot of competition, there's a lot of wasps, and they're all competing for a limited amount of resources as far as protein from other insects that they might hunt. Climate change, heat, parasites. There's a particular type of moth that goes after Vespula nests, and if that moth gets into one of these nests, it'll lay its eggs inside, and then when those larvae hatch, the moth larvae, they will feed on the larva and the pupating adults inside the Vespula nest, so they could get hit by that anytime. So there's a number of different things that may cause a nest not to thrive as fast or as large as you might think it would. Only a couple feet away from this nest, in fact, on the exterior of the same barn, there's a paper wasp called Polistes dominula, which is an invasive species, a very aggressive invasive species, which, like the Germanica being invasive as well, they go after all the same resources. So they're going to be hunting down the same insects, they're going to be going for the same nectar on the same flowers locally. So it may just be tough for this nest to compete. So based on what we were seeing, we decided to set up a little chicken shack experiment to test their interest in protein. So today we're going to do a little experiment with our German wasp, Vespula Germanica. They're in the cavity of the barn wall, and we're going to document how they take to this chicken. This little house used to be in one of the wasp habitats. So we're just going to put some of this chicken right in the house. Fill it up with some tasty bits, because right now they're still trying to forage for protein for a while. Eventually they'll switch to sugar after their nest hatches out, but for now they're still looking for protein. So what we did was mount a little stand right outside their front door. And on that stand, we're going to put our little birdhouse full of chicken meat. So we're going to see how long it takes them to find this meat and use it for protein. Now, next door, we have these guys. This is a very active nest of Polistes dominula. Maybe they'll come find it too. We'll see how it goes. So as you see here, it didn't take long for Yellowjackets to start sniffing around the chicken shack. We started nicknaming it the Yellowjack's Chicken Shack. But it seemed that most of the activity at the chicken shack actually came from Yellowjackets from outside the barn. In other words, a different colony from somewhere else. It seemed like the Yellowjackets from the barn nest would take notice of it, but they didn't go for it. They didn't jump in there and grab that meat and fly with it like a lot of the others that we started to see coming in and out of there that belonged to other nests. So that leads us to believe maybe that there's fewer larvae in that small nest after all that's still inside the barn wall cavity. Because if they're not going for protein lately, even though it's right in front of their nest, then they're probably just nectaring, feeding themselves or adults, as opposed to trying to feed larvae. You see how this one flew in, smelled around, and then took off again. You'll see later in the video that the wasps from outside this colony that came from other places and found this chicken, man, they just dove in hardcore, taking out huge chunks of chicken and flying off with it. We just weren't seeing that kind of behavior from the ones right here locally in this nest in the wall. They kind of buzz around it, they sniff around it, they come back maybe, but seemed less interested. You see a wasp like this who's exploring the environment like anything that they would find that was new in front of their nest. But they're not exploring it like they're extremely interested in the food. They're exploring it like it's just a new object that they're trying to assess whether or not it's a threat, for example. Eventually you see this wasp turn around and it kind of finally decides to go in and look around. That is not the sign of a very protein-hungry wasp. You see this forager flying in, basically flying right past the chicken, going right back to the nest. By contrast, here's a wasp from another colony that flew in and found the chicken. It's clearly feeding larvae, because it flew in and within seconds it had a mouthful of chicken and was flying right back out the door again. You see him right here exiting. Here's another with the footage slowed down. There's no hesitation at all. They stop, they go in, they eat, they bring food back to their larva. We'll skip to where this forager exits. They're carrying back loads of protein that are so big they can hardly carry them. So the chicken shack started getting busy, but not with the nest we expected it to be busy with. There was all these yellowjackets flying in from around the neighborhood. And they were clearly in a pretty rapid race to get that meat to the larva. There were flies that started coming and going as well, so there was a bit of a competition between the flies and the yellowjackets. Interestingly, the yellowjackets seemed to leave the flies alone. They just sort of worked side by side. You can see the meatballs that they're pulling out of here are pretty sizable. This one has a small meatball. It's beginning to malaxate, and they'll just keep chewing it up and chewing it up and chewing it up and adding to it until they have quite a good sizable piece that they're going to fly off with. So this one just goes back in for more to create an even bigger meatball. And when he takes off here, he's moving so fast, he's literally just a blur. So it didn't take long before the chicken shack was in full swing all day long. They were coming, they were going. They ended up chewing it right down to the bone in no time. But throughout all that activity, we were not seeing a lot of them flying back to our nest in the barn wall. They were flying away to other nests around the neighborhood. Here we finally had one of the Polistes dominula from the nest next door come and check it out, but they never really did engage with this particular protein either. When we checked out their nest, this made sense. All of their larvae were gone, had pupated into adult wasps, so they had nothing left to feed. Whereas the yellowjacket nests you see being supported here by these foragers are clearly in full swing. The only reason they would bring meat back like this is if they had plenty of larvae that was still viable. This wasp made such a huge chicken meatball that it could barely fly with it. We pulled the camera back hoping to watch this thing fly off with this giant meatball, but he ended up crashing onto the deck. So we pulled back the frame here a little bit to show the entrance of the barn nest up above the chicken shack. And as you can see, all the wasps that are hitting the chicken shack are flying off with the chicken in the opposite direction. And the wasps that you see here returning to the barn have not been in the chicken shack and do not appear to be carrying a lot of protein. August 31st, 2022. Just going to document that we found a larva outside the nest on the little shelf on which we put chicken inside this little shack. The Yellowjack's chicken shack was kind of a hit. There was a lot of them coming and going there for a while. Then we had a rainstorm and a windstorm over the last couple of days, and that slowed them down, so we'll just have to replace the chicken probably inside. It was just regular barbecued chicken bits left over from a meal, so it was put in there for the Yellowjackets to eat. And they normally go through this front door. We haven't seen a lot of activity from them today. And the fact that there's a little larva right here, that's sometimes they'll pull their own larva out of the nest at the end of the season, but it seems early for that. But we'll see. We'll go take a look at it today. Seems the nest hasn't grown all that significantly. But there's definitely some new paper on it, and paper towards the back, behind the nest. They've been quiet today, not a lot of activity out there, even though it's a beautiful sunny day. Boy, that's a gorgeous little nest. Browns and greens and grays, so pretty. Can't see the opening of the nest from here, from this angle. We might put the scope cam in there again one of these days and take a peek. But for now, it seems like nobody's home. Knock, knock, anybody home? Ominously quiet. Well, we'll check it again in a couple of days. So we just dumped out the chicken shack, and it's all fly larvae in there as we expected, just maggots from typical black flies most likely. So if you look at those chicken bones, they were picked clean. The Yellowjackets clearly had eaten them right up. There was no meat left on those bones at all. So we started out Yellowjack's Chicken Shack version 2 here on August 31st to see how that would work out. Version 2 was an even bigger hit because now half the Yellowjackets in the neighborhood, it seemed, were fully aware of the location of this chicken shack just for them. So they were coming from all over the place. But again, what we weren't seeing was a lot of them going to the barn nest. And we were not seeing hardly any activity at all from the barn nest wasps coming and going. So this was further indication that there's something going on with that barn nest that's keeping it from thriving, or that it had an early season. So we pulled the framing back on this shot just to include the door, the front door of the barn nest, which is that nail hole above the chicken shack. And as you can see, like the wasp had just left the chicken shack, they're still flying in the opposite direction, off to different nests. Here's another one flying off in the opposite direction. And then keep your eye on the hole of the barn nest up above by the nail hole. You're going to see one from the nest in the barn fly off, go out foraging, but he goes right by the chicken shack off for something else. And that we saw pretty routinely as well. So one would assume from that maybe they're just going out for nectar at this point, or they're going out for wood pulp to keep maintaining the nest, but there's no larva to feed protein to, maybe. But the chicken shack just kept getting busier and busier with more and more wasps coming from wherever, the different neighborhood nests, picking up protein, taking off, really picking those bones clean over the next day or so. And just like with the first chicken shack experiment, the flies came around pretty quickly too, so we knew we'd be filled up with fly larvae here again pretty quickly. Just as a further experiment, we decided to add some fruit, in this case a crushed fig, to the deck and see if that would lure some of the barn wasps in, because it's sugar, carbohydrate as opposed to protein. But again, this appealed mostly to wasps from other colonies. We weren't seeing a lot of activity from the barn nest at all. The fig attracted a ton of different wasps, mostly yellowjackets, and a lot of flies of various sizes, even a spider at one point. Wasps from other colonies were interested in everything, the chicken shack, the fig. One of them even buzzed the larva that was laying there on the deck. In nature, yellowjackets are one of the beneficial insects that actually help reduce carrion out in the field. They will eat up whatever protein meat is left in dead animals and that kind of thing. They help break down those things in the environment. So this behavior of protein collection as scavengers is quite natural to them. So over time, it got busier and busier here. There were German Yellowjackets. The great majority were German Yellowjackets. And that's generally what we see around here. But there was also some Squamosa, which is the southern Yellowjacket. Seemed like most were interested in the protein, but there was a significant number of them that were interested in the fig and continually came back for that. Now, as this was going on, take a close look at the nail hole, which is the entrance and exit for the barn nest. You're going to see one of the foragers come out with a larva in its mandibles. It's carrying a larva out of the nest. Now, this would be the second larva we saw come down to the deck. What we don't know is if this was a robbery of the nest. Other wasps, in other words, had discovered it and started attacking it and pulling the larva out. Or if this was just an end-of-season behavior from the wasps that were born in that nest and they're beginning to clear out their larvae because their nest is coming to an end, which would be a natural part of their behavior, despite the fact that August 31st seems a little early for that. And there could be other reasons they're dumping the larva. Maybe there's disease, or maybe there's parasites, maybe they're just not thriving and they're dying in the nest. All those reasons result in larvae being discarded. You'll notice that the yellowjacket that pulled the larva out here crash landed on the deck. They misjudge the amount of weight they can carry initially, and sometimes they crash land and then they have to sort of readjust before they can take off again. So with the fixed angle of this shot, we weren't able to tell what became of this larva, whether it was just discarded and thrown outside the nest or whether it was taken out and eaten somewhere. So as you can see, as the chicken shack gets all the action, you can watch as the barn wasps keep showing up and going into their hole without seeming to interact with the chicken at all. So we kept up some relatively long-term surveillance on this nest and on the chicken shack, and we're not seeing any action going from the barn nest to the chicken protein, and we weren't seeing any insect protein being flown back into the barn nest. So it doesn't bode well for the future of that nest. We're thinking maybe they're pretty much done. But they may still have some pupating wasps, and they may still have some adults in the nest. We don't know. Time will tell. Here's a slow motion clip of one of their foragers coming back, and it sure doesn't look like they're carrying any protein from anywhere. Meanwhile, we kept seeing these other wasps just hitting that chicken all day long. And that went on for days. And that tells us that in general, we're still mid-season on a lot of Germanica nests in the neighborhood. They're still cranking along just fine with larvae. Here another barn wasp comes home seemingly empty-handed, while multiple others come in and hit that shack and hit the fig. Here's another barn wasp flying in with seemingly nothing in hand. Maybe something very small, but if it's there, it's very hard to see. But you do see foragers continually leave like this and go out. So maybe they're just nectaring, we don't know. But if you look at this wasp who flies into the chicken shack, walks around, is clearly aware that there's plenty of protein and meat in there. It walks in, it walks out, it walks up on the roof. It kind of checks out the whole structure, and then it appears to decide it's not interested and takes off. That could be another one either from the barn nest or another nest that no longer requires protein. Whereas these guys that you see here, or gals more likely, the female foragers, they are indeed protein hungry, still, as we go into September. So the next day we moved into September. This is September 1st of 2022. The fig remained very popular. As you can see here on the left side of the fig, there's a small spider, while the wasp is working away on the top of the fig. A lot of large flies came and went as well. There were some rumbles between insect species. Every now and then you see the fly get into it with the wasp. They dive bomb each other and try to hog the food for themselves. We never once saw a wasp actually attack a fly. Like if you look into bald-faced hornets, they will just take flies out. But we weren't seeing that from the yellowjackets at all. Maybe it's just a matter of because there's plenty of other food around, there was no worries. Here you see the wasp and the fly and the little spider on the left all hitting that fig pretty well at the same time. Seems like as long as there's a good buffet line going on, everybody gets along. There were several times where we'd notice a wasp coming out of the chicken shack with no meat. And that let us wonder whether or not there were fluids in there they were eating, or if there was some kind of other material they would chew up and then just fly out after they had enough. But we thought it could be maybe they just run each other out of there sometimes. Like you can see this one getting into it with another one, biting its leg and chasing it off. If If we punch in on this and replay it in slower motion, watch the one on the left just boxing away at the other one and then biting its leg. A couple of times it bites legs. There again, bit another leg. Just a meanie. And that kind of behavior happened pretty often. And they're both German Yellowjackets, so it makes you wonder if they were from different colonies and somehow they knew that, or if they do that to each other even within the same colony. Regardless, it stayed very busy at the chicken shack until all that meat was gone. And that took several days. So we're just going to show you a montage here of the Yellowjackets feeding on chicken protein, just because it's interesting to see how they collect and forage and scavenge for meat in the wild. And granted, this is a setup scenario where chicken was put out for them, but this is exactly how they operate as scavengers when they find dead animals out there in the world, or when they go after dumpsters, or when they go after your food at a picnic. It's all the same behavior, so it's worthy of a close look here. So here we are on September 3rd, 2022, a couple days later, and that chicken shack was still getting steady traffic all day and all through the night until right up until dark. And something we noticed on September 3rd more than the other days that we had done the chicken shack experiment was that there was more wasps that would go in, spend a significant amount of time in there, and then come out empty-handed, or seemingly so. Plenty more were coming out with meat, but many of them would come out with nothing, which led us to believe maybe they're eating something down there that allows them to get nutrition or fluids or salts or something, and then they would leave without having to carry a load back to the nest. So if there's any Germanica experts out there that might know what exactly it is that they're fueling up on in there that they don't have to carry back to the nest, we'd be interested in hearing that. Here again, we'll punch in and lighten it up a little bit so you can see some of the aggressive behavior between wasps that appear to be of the same species. They're biting each other and snapping at each other and boxing each other. They chase each other right out of the shack at times. So a couple days later, here on September 5th, they were still hitting the fig pretty hard and hitting the chicken shack every day, throughout the day. Here you have a squamosa, that's a southern yellowjacket, eating the fig. Interestingly, we never did see the squamosa go for the chicken, only for the fig. So it led us to believe that maybe this particular nest, wherever the squamosa nest is, they're usually subterranean somewhere, maybe that one already had hatched out. There's no more larvae to feed if they're only nectaring on fruit. Meanwhile, all the Germans we saw were still hitting the chicken bones real hard. They had really reduced the bones and the mass of the meat in that chicken shack significantly, as you can see here. They've eaten them all the way down. And they were really chewing hard on a white substance connected to the bone. We took that to be some type of high-protein gristle or tendon or maybe marrow, hard to tell. The white material almost seemed crystallized, and as they chewed it, you could hear them clicking and making that hard scraping sound against it. Meanwhile, the squamosa foragers, the southern yellowjackets, they just stay on their own. They would not engage with the chicken shack. They'd stay away from the other yellowjackets. Kind of hung around near the fig most of the time. Meanwhile, back inside the barn on the 5th of September 22, there'd been no significant change at all with the nest. And it still looked basically abandoned almost compared to others we've seen this same week or two of the month. They just look a little bit done. That said, we do still see foragers coming and going occasionally from the front door hole. So it does appear that there are some active wasps left in that nest, and they are foraging for something. Just doesn't appear to be protein for larvae. But we're not 100% sure of that. It would take a little scope camera work to get that verified, but we don't have access to the whole of the nest at this point with the viewing window up. So we may try to find our way around that plexiglass viewing window one of these days and try to get a scope cam up in there. For now, the theory is something caused this particular Germanica nest to have a very short season. It could be anything from the queen being killed or dying. It could be the larva became parasitized. It could be it was just a low population nest naturally and it had no problems. It just simply seasoned out. Whatever it was or is, it doesn't seem to be affecting some other Germanica nests. As you can see here, these guys are still chowing down on whatever's left over, that chicken meat and bone. They seem to be focused on that white crystallized substance inside the bone or attached to the bone. The floor of the shack is covered in fly larvae. It's all maggots. They seem to completely ignore the maggots. They don't eat them. They don't interact with them at all. It appears they just keep going for this white substance left over inside the chicken bones or attached to the bones. One interesting note is they did not seem to fly a lot with this material. They seem to chew it up, ingest whatever it is they're ingesting, and then take off. As things started winding down, you can see here, sometimes there was nothing left but maggots in there. And the leftover bones were just shredded. You can see down the bottom of the shack, just flakes and crumbs. There was just nothing left of some of it. We checked around the area, but we never could locate where this squamosa nest was. Usually they're subterranean, but we could not find them. It wouldn't be surprising if we get a call from a client one of these days from the area saying they've got a substantial number of yellowjackets coming up and down from their ground in their yard. As we focus here for a minute on this one female Germanica wasp in the chicken shack, just watch how the fluids in her mouth help dissolve that bone. She's constantly producing a little bit of fluid as she chews and shaves away the white substance on that bone. It's pretty amazing the amount of solid material they can work their way through. And it remains a mystery right now what exactly they're getting from this material. Is it salt? Are they seeking sodium? Are they seeking protein? Whatever it is, they don't seem to be creating meatballs with it. Sometimes they'll have a chunk of it and take off with it, but oftentimes we just saw this. They're chewing and shaving it away, and they stay in there for extended periods doing this. And the material just falls away or dissolves, which leads us to believe they're ingesting something through the saliva that they break it down with. And it's unclear if this is for them, the adult wasps, or if it's something that they're going to regurgitate maybe to larva in some nest somewhere. So if anybody out there knows, and they've specifically seen this type of thing in research or whatnot, let us know what you think. We'd be very interested to hear your opinions out there. But if you just watch here for a few minutes, they seem entirely focused on this stuff, like committed to eating this stuff and dissolving it and chewing it. So it seems to be important in one way or another to whatever it is they're trying to get for nutrition. As this one worked away on her piece of it, more and more of them kept showing up and doing the same thing. You'll see here in the next clip or so, 4 or 5 of them at a time in there doing the exact same thing. And unlike with the chicken meat that they pulled off the bones at the early part of these chicken shack experiments, none of them seem to be pulling anything out at this point. They seem to be actually physically eating the stuff themselves inside the shack. That's it for today's video. Thanks for being here with us. Have a good one.